Thank you for accepting my paper. Thank you to the ATS committee for accepting the proposal. I would like to perhaps introduce the topic a little bit from a position of my own origins. I'm from Europe. I'm a German. My mother's Dutch. And as you all know, there is a huge war happening right now in Europe. It's the worst war the greatest war after the Second World War that we are witnessing at these moments. And it makes a person who has relatives there who are in one or more ways connected to the effects of that war, sensitive to the language of war, to the language of battle rhetoric, and to the language of propaganda as it is being used. So this really motivated me to look at Jeremiah and see how he deals with that language. We can see that the merging of the language of holiness and the language of the battlefield is typical for any war rhetoric. The ultimate legitimization of war uses elements of sacred language. Holy deed, I'm just quoting. Sacrificial walk, or Goebbels' Opfergang. Heil Hitler, or sacred obligation, if I'm quoting here, the US president in his talk in Poland a couple of weeks ago. Death on the battlefield is pictured as a tragic but heroic and as an ultimate testimony of holy dedication and loyalty. Consequently, as acts, war and worship have much in common. Their liturgies, their songs, missions, and calls for duty share similar elements. They reveal that dedication and holiness are closely related concepts. The ultimate form of dedication is seen when one gives his or her life for the greater good. When a soldier goes to war, he is, in the romanticized interpretation of war, a holy hero, willing to carry out his duty selflessly as a form of dedication to the fatherland, to the crown, to freedom, democracy, or other noble values. It is in the context of our war times that I want to explore Jeremiah's cultic underpinnings of military language in 5 different text passages in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah has been recognized as one of the greatest poets of the Tanakh. Scholarship has therefore sought to identify him as the author of a multitude of psalms, and the Judeo-Christian tradition has often believed that the poetry and mourning and the skillful narratives of the books of Kings and Lamentations have the prophet Jeremiah as their origin. Particularly characteristic of Jeremiah's rhetoric is, however, not his focus on language aesthetics, but language deconstruction. In several cases, he uses language in unexpected ways. Havel, Havelu, Shaket, Shoket, Vahidevara, Adonai, Foket, Fakat, and one could use many more other examples. While his language follows the rule of standard Hebrew grammar, he deviates at times drastically from the standard of language pragmatics. These deviations disturb the listener as the prophet breaks with semantic conventions and the pragmatic language valence. However, his disruptive use of language invites for deconstruction of biases embodied in our language practice. And, like a surgeon of the mind, his language rewires synapses so that new thoughts are possible and new hermeneutical horizons can be explored. My presentation will heavily rely on valence analysis in order to trace Jeremiah's deviation from standard Hebrew language pragmatics. And when you have a look at my paper, I have a footnote here, footnote number 2, where you have a link. You can go there, and it gives you access to the different codes I was running in order to retrieve linguistic data in order to make my argument. After going through these text passages, I will attempt, I will go through 5 text passages, and after doing so, I will attempt to follow along the lines of Jeremiah's deconstructive language in order to sketch a new hermeneutical horizon for the interpretation of human wars. One could argue that Jeremiah is the most violent prophet. The most violent prophetic book, definitely, is to be identified with the book of Jeremiah. No other book uses so often verbs of active life extinctions like kill, murder, slaughter, execute. You have the Hebrew terms here available if you want to look them up. And nominal forms as well, like butcher, death, execution, slaughtering, stroke. The graph that you see in my image shows, in the figure number 1, shows that no other book in the Bible uses so many words that target life extinction. The one that gets closest to Jeremiah is the book of Leviticus, for obvious reasons, as it describes the manifold ways of animal slaughter in the context of the cult. But what is much more remarkable, in my opinion, is how Jeremiah uses some of these words. To illustrate this, let us have a look at our first text. I'm here on page number 4 now. You see Jeremiah 39 displayed. I will look at verse 6, but I have printed the context a little bit here for you so that you can identify how this verse is embedded in this narration. In Jeremiah 39:6, Nebuchadnezzar executes the sons of King Zedekiah as well as the members of the aristocracy. The word used for the execution is shachat. Shachat, and comes from cult language. Most modern translations render the word with slaughter, which is not a wrong translation. It's an okay translation, but it does not fully capture the actual meaning of shachat. Consulting comprehensive dictionaries like Halot are also not always helpful, as they do not inform the user about the distribution of the different valences and thus do often not shed light on the usage of a verb in the context of language pragmatics. Shachat is dominantly used in the cultic context of Leviticus and Jeremiah, as we will see, as a simple word search can show. And you see this in the next graph, figure number 2. 45% of the word usage appear in Leviticus. The cultic nature of the word is even more obvious when analyzing the valence of shachat. Shachat requires a direct object. Shachat something. You have to shachat something. You have to shachat an object. Now, when you're trying to retrieve all proper nouns as syntactical objects of shachat, you will see that you only find animals, obviously, ram, lamb, bull, bird, or technical terms like sin offering, chatat, or asham, and terms like these. Now, you see on the next page, page 6, 3 columns of graphs. I have one with the English translation, and then one with the transliteration, and then one with the Hebrew terms. You just have to read it in reverse because Panda Python coding is not able to read Hebrew in the right direction. So, but when you look at it, you will see that there's an interesting deviation in this list. When you go through the list, it's all these animals, right? All these animals or technical terms of cult language, lechatat. But the data shows that when shachat is being used as slaughter, it always has a specific goal in mind, namely sacrifice. You cannot slaughter and then eat for meat production. Shachat is slaughtering for sacrifice. So the English language does not seem to have a verb that captures this idea well. At least I'm not aware of it. In German, there's a difference being made between, I know some of you here speak German, there are a couple of Germans here too as well. The German makes a difference between schlachten, slaughter, and schächten, which is ritual slaughter. This word, however, is not available in the English, and so slaughter is probably the best translation, but it would need a footnote or more to explain what's going on. Now you see that there's a word appearing as well. Here's the second word, ben, son, and you might wonder, well, this is human being, right? So human beings. No, actually, if you have a look at these cases, this is not referring to human beings, but as a reference to the young bull or the young goat or the young. I give you here the references. So also here, of course, we have the exception, Genesis 22. with Abraham's son being a sacrificial animal, but even there, from a linguistic perspective, it is fully in coherence with the pragmatics of sacrificial shachat language. The retrieved valence data, however, leads us to Jeremiah's Wortgewalt, force of words. In the list of objects appears an exception. You might have been able to see it in one of those columns. Namely, we have two proper names being listed. Yeah, you see them? Zedekiyahu and Yehuda. Two proper names. Zedekiah 3 times, Judah 2 times. This is a radical deviation from the typical valence patterns for two reasons. Namely, human beings are not appearing as objects of shachat in general, as the Israelite cult does not include human sacrifices. And second, there where shachat targets human beings, they are not mentioned by their proper name, but by use of pronominal suffixes, they, them, that they try to avoid the personal connotation. I think that's for psychological reasons, but that's an argument I don't want to make here, right now here. Zedekiah and Judah are exceptional cases appear only in Jeremiah, and one case in 2 Kings 25:7, where most scholars would say, well, this is actually Jeremianic. So you see the text here displayed where the word shachat appears in these three texts. So the similarities between, the commentaries and exegetes, if you consult commentaries and exegetes on these texts, they do not discuss the interpretative consequences of such awkward use of language. Craig is completely silent about it. Holliday acknowledges that this is a term that comes from the cultic language. Lundbom even goes so far as he quotes Milgram, but nobody does anything with it in terms of what does this do to the interpretation of the text. I suspect part of the reason is that the modern language user is no longer conscious of the original context of words like slaughter. When saying, some Brazilians here, forgive me for this example, but when saying things like, in the World Cup, Brazil got slaughtered 7-1 in Belo Horizonte, yeah, that the meaning of to slaughter has morphed into nothing but a more graphic imagination of killing can also be assumed by the fact that the word slaughter as a metaphor is being used quite often in our English language. Or I slaughtered the guy. Yeah? So it's quite common as an extreme version of killing. Yeah? So from a linguistic perspective, one would say that the metaphor has become a dead metaphor, like with the word crane. The fact that a new building is being raised here in Denver with a couple of cranes does no longer trigger within the language user an association with the bird. Crane. It's a dead metaphor. So the question then is whether what applies to the modern speaker with regard to the word slaughter is the case for Jeremiah's time as well. Perhaps it's a dormant, dead metaphor as well here for Jeremiah. For this to be the case, we would need to find a frequent use of shachat outside of the cult context. This, however, and you see this in my queries, is not the case. The data supports what Milgram has claimed already in his commentary on Leviticus 1991 when stating that shachat always means ritual slaughter. Not only in the Tanakh, but also in the later rabbinic tradition, this is true. Consequently, I suggest that Jeremiah must have shocked his reader and listeners by using dedicated ritual slaughter language. The sons of Zedekiah and the aristocracy were not killed. They were not slaughtered in the sense of animals for meat production. Yeah? No, rather Jeremiah paints a picture of Zedekiah's sons being sacrificed. A similar language is being used in the oracles against Babylon when the prophet lets Adonai say, I will bring them down like lambs to the slaughter, like rams and male goats. The question triggered by such ritual language to us and for the original readers and listeners, I assume, is where is the altar? What sin is to be atoned? Who is the sinner? And where is the priest? I suggest that Jeremiah invites the reader to envision King and Father Zedekiah attending a sacrificial ceremony where his own innocent young sons are put to death for his, that is, the king's own sins. Jeremiah repurposes the term shachat to blend the world of sanctity with the world of politics. This manner of language usage is found only in 4 other places in Jeremiah, and you see the references. In all these places, Jeremiah could have used the typical word for killing. Harak, the Hefil, Piel, or Hofal forms of Mut, Nakah, which we know he does. He does. I give you here an example of Jeremiah 52, verse 27, where you see this more normal use of the word to kill. But as a prophet from priestly family, he chooses, in certain contexts, to identify human execution with sacrificial slaughter, particularly when innocent humans are killed. Whether Jeremiah wants to believe that Nebuchadnezzar actually performed ritual slaughter on Zedekiah's son is unclear. What we can minimally conclude is that the already awful sight of execution is made mentally even more unbearable as the prophet makes the king and Judean remnants aware of matters of guilt, because it's a sacrifice, matters of guilt and failed personal responsibility when he brings his audience with the language of the cult to an altar where young boys are being sacrificed. This cruel worship ceremony is the last one that Zedekiah will participate with open eyes. Jeremiah's use of worship language in this narration of war events might have been stimulated by rituals of child sacrifice in the valley of the son of Hinnom. This is the next text that we are going to have a look at. You see it here, Jeremiah 7, 32 till 34, where the child sacrifices that took place in the valley of Ben Hinnom are being brought up. I'm on page number 11 now. For Jeremiah, this place, the valley of Ben Hinnom, is representing the climax of immorality, you could say. He mentions this place of cruelty 9 times in Jeremiah. No other book in the Tanakh refers to this place as often as Jeremiah does. The valley was located right outside of the southwestern wall of Jerusalem and was used as a site for idolatry. The Masoretic text does not give us more information about the meaning and the background of Ben Hinnom. Literally, it would mean the son of Hinnom. But the Greek text in Jeremiah 19, verse 2 has a parallel account there and adds some interesting information. The Greek text says, refers to the valley as burial ground of Hinnom's son. I give you here the Greek reference as well. Thus, one can assume that the name of the valley indicates that a son of a man named Hinnom was buried there. In the context of child sacrifices taking place in that valley, it might likely have been either the first child that has been sacrificed there or a most dramatic child sacrifice that burnt itself deep into the memory of the people. Any sacrifice, and I think this is an important element for my argument that I'm trying to do, any sacrifice is motivated by the longing to improve one's quality of life. For any religion, that's the case. Usually the quality of life was measured by the number of children, by a good harvest, by political stability or wealth. Sacrificing one's child then was the ultimate expression of the longing for progress. The fact that Adonai predicts that the name of the valley will be changed to Valley of Slaughter, verse 32, Valley of Slaughter, has to be understood in the context of the lex talionis. Yahweh's act consists of returning the evil of the people and having them face the fate that is intrinsically part of their own action. In many ways and in different forms, Yahweh has repeatedly explained the rationale for the potentially upcoming judgment. However, when he faces the valley of Hinnom, Ben Hinnom, with the rising smoke of the pagan altars, the screaming of to-be slaughtered children, and the moaning of the cult prostitutes, kindles in the divine speech the call for judgment, verses 33 to 34. The announced judgment over Judah takes the form of an antithesis to the cultic slaughtering of human children. This can explain why Jeremiah, as a priest, likes to use ritual language when he predicts the coming of judgment. The divine judgment is portrayed as a lex talionis cult slaughter against the apostate cult slaughtering of the sons by Judah's fathers. So you have the slaughtering of sons, apostate slaughtering of sons as a sacrifice. The fathers sacrifice their sons. And then the judgment is, I will sacrifice the fathers, right, who have sacrificed their sons. That's lex talionis. you see, when you go to the parallel account in Jeremiah 19, verse 6, actually there, the word lachein, the therefore, the argumentative causative particle is being used to explain why why Adonai turns this valley into a valley of slaughter, because of the slaughtering that has taken place there. While the context of Jeremiah 7:31 till 32 and 19:5 till 6 is clearly cultic, the Masoretic text does not use the word shachat for valley of slaughter. You would have expected a valley, a guy, shachat, but that's not happening there. It actually says gai ha-rigaya, so from harak, which is the normal word for slaughter, like killing human beings. However, if you look at the Greek text, you see that the cultic language is further developed. A wordplay is entertained here in the Greek text as it announces that the new name for the burial ground of Hinnom's son will be the burial ground of Sphages, the Greek word for slaughter. And the Greek word for slaughter, Sphage, is cultic. It's basically, you see in the next clause, actually, the verbal form is being used, sphazo, which is the Greek standard word used for translating the word shachat. So in the Greek text, this is from the beginning until the end cultic. Thus, the Greek text continues with cultic language and portraits Adonai, who will sacrifice the boule, the plans of Judah and Jerusalem. Thus, for the Greek text, the divine sacrifice focuses not so much on the actual carnage that takes place on the battlefield, but because it says sacrificing the boule, sacrificing the plans, it emphasizes rather the conceptual idea that Judah's plans and economic dreams, its national ambitions and political strategies will be slaughtered like a sacrificial element on the altar of human progression. That is, the altar of idolatry. Let me move to the next text, the third text. Chapter 8, verse 10. It's basically the continuation of what we have just read. Just in the medieval times, when we introduced chapters and verse divisions, it got disconnected. But if you look at the Hebrew, it's actually just continuing the previous speech, and is basically just closing the discussion that we just had about the Ben Hinnom Valley. I'll skip some of the reasons why this is to be read in context. But what you see in Jeremiah 8, 1 till 3 is that all of a sudden, it's like a weird resurrection story. All those bones are coming out of the earth, and from a New Testament perspective, you think, oh, life is coming. No, it's further away than that. It's kind of a negative resurrection story where these bones are being brought up and being ashamed under the sun, the moon, and the stars, which those bones have worshipped before. I'm just trying to summarize here a bit so that we can spend a little bit more time on the theological conclusions. With this description, verse 2, the silence and effeteness of man's projected idols, sun, moon, astronomic realities, manifests themselves. That the idols represent death becomes clear in verse 2b. They are not able to bring back the lost life, but rather cause the further decomposition of human remains. In the context of the cultic slaughter language that we just saw in chapter 7, we see how the prophet continues his ritual drawing. The sacrificial slaughtering of Judah climaxes with dead bodies appearing under the sun, under the moon, under the host of heaven, as if it were a final last worshipping community. The last text I'm going to look at, the fourth text, you find in Jeremiah 48, verse 14 till 15, and this is on page number 14. In the oracle against Moab, the prophet looks into the future and hears, in Jeremiah 48, verse 14, how Moab is proud of war heroes and men of battle. Verse 14. But when the prophetic eye looks, a verse later, in Jeremiah 48, verse 15, at the strong, well-trained, and fully specced soldiers, it just sees a selection of young, and I might want to add, innocent boys. Literally, it would have to be rendered selection of its youth. Georg Fischer has this beautiful description. It says, Blüte der Jugend. That's how he translated it, the blossoming of the youth. So innocent boys, that are sent to their own slaughter. The warriors and great men of strength who were applauded in verse 14b and seemed to be ready for any battle are now seen as simple and naive young boys who march towards their own execution. As seen earlier, cult vocabulary is used. Moab's boys are not murdered or executed on the battlefield. No, they are treated like sacrificial animals prepared for their slaughter. And again, I would like to refer to the oracle against Babylon where it says, I will bring them down like lambs to the slaughter, like rams and male goats in the context of battle. The oracle then chooses to interpret the carnage of war not as the simple dark outcome of human politics, but of worship. Worship for a God who requires child sacrifices. I think you can see now how the horrific child sacrifices in the Ben Hinnom Valley are perceived in the same way as the dead soldiers on the battlefield. I'll skip the fifth text in which the prophet describes the Battle of Carchemish as an event in which Yahweh held, literally, a sacrifice, a tzevach le'Adonai, by the river Euphrates, and I will instead finish with concluding remarks. From the prophetic perspective, war cannot comprehensively be understood from the horizontal human axis of action only. Therefore, the reader-listener will find regularly war approached from the vertical axis of human worship and spirituality. In Jeremiah 8, verse 2, the killed warriors of war are described as corpses that gather before sun. We just looked at that, before sun, the moon, and the stars, that they loved, Ahav, that they served, Avat, that they inquired, Darash, all spiritual language, and worshipped, Hishtachava. All central terms that describe the worship of deities are used. The prophet seeks to connect the cruelties of war and battle with the religious sphere and divine judgment. The cruel end of the life of soldiers is not described in sober and objective ways, but with cultic language. The nation's leader do not simply die and are not killed in battle, but slaughtered like sacrificial animals. Not only the Masoretic text, but also the Greek text makes this connection explicit. The Greek text uses the same language for the death through battle as it uses the language for describing the child sacrifices in the Ben Hinnom Valley. In Jeremiah 25:34, a text we haven't looked at yet, but I'm just referring you to that verse, the Greek text adds another cultic terminus technicus in order to establish the link between human war and religious cult. It refers to the young soldiers as selected rams, a technical term, the Septuagint from Leviticus. The young warriors are like those rams and sheep that had to go through a selection process if they were to be sacrificed. I mean, imagine in modern military, there's a selection process as well. The prophet sees kind of the similarities between cultic selection of rams and then warrior selection. The linguistic and thematic links established by Jeremiah between idol worship, child sacrifices, and human war suggests to the modern reader-listener a new assessment of war and its human language of legitimization. Jeremiah wonders whether the recruiting of young soldiers is, in essence, identical to the idolatrous cruelty of child sacrifices. In Jeremiah 48:14-15, man's interpretation of war and Yahweh's perspective on human war clash. In verse 14, Moab sees in its young men heroes and men of war that battle for power, fame, and glory. In contrast, the following verse 15 looks with divine eyes on Moab soldiers and sees simple boys who march towards their own execution as sacrificial animals. The oracle against Moab chooses to interpret the carnage of war not as the simple dark outcome of human politics, but as a result of worship. In this view, then, Moab's idolatry turns out to be worship for a God who requires child sacrifices through war. Religion as a form of socially organized human illusion that seeks to live a life of progress and prosperity turns into historic nightmare. Earlier texts have shown that the human strive for power, economic success, and cultural progress finally evokes the demons of war And I give you some references here. From this perspective, modern politics of nationalism, colonialism, and racism are therefore, in essence, pagan idolatry in demythologized form. Moab's worship is not a battle for glory, but in the eyes of Adonai, the end of humanity. The prophet then uses the language of worship to unlock the rhetoric of man's popular justification for war. By doing so, the prophet uncovers dark motivations that are fueled by a diabolic mixture of human religion, human ambitions, and human immorality. The death on the battlefield of human ambitions are seen as sacrifices for the gods of progression, which are nothing else than the fantasies of power projected by human beings onto the surface of religious beliefs and lived out through war. War is worship. It's the most hollow form of holiness.